Gave me the mentor hour. We appreciate everybody's participation. It seems to grow and grow and grow, and we like that very much. So encourage everybody to take part. Today, you're gonna have to listen to me. Glad to have you here. This is something that means an awful lot to me and seems to have struck a chord in an awful lot of people. We're going to talk about research. And even though this has to do with research on the book that I wrote, this is not research for writing a book. This is research for anything. And even the Greene County Prosecutor's Office had me do this because he thought it would be good for their investigators to go through what we're going to talk about pertaining to research. Because we all do have to do some research, whether we write nonfiction or fiction, we still have to research some things, right? If we're going to get the setting right, we need to research that setting, you know, that type of thing. So research is part of all of our writing. We all get involved in it from time to time, whatever it is that we happen to be writing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How many have read Sarah Burney up to this point? How many are going to tell me they did and didn't? For those of you that have not known about it, it is a true story that pertains to my father's side of the family. This is Dad's family out in front of the farmhouse. This was taken in about 1945 to maybe 47. And as you can see, this farmhouse, this was just outside of Ava in Douglas County. And as you can see, this is kind of a nasty old farmhouse. Just, you know, a lot of the wood is rotting away here. You can see an awful lot of gaps in the boards there. And there was a whole heck of a lot of kids. My grandmother gave birth to 11, 9 lived. Okay, so there were 9 kids in this tiny 2-bedroom shack, basically was what it was. And that's Dad right there. And his twin brother, my grandparents, Orville and Sarah right here, and her parents, my great-grandparents. And by the way, if you can't see that detail real clear, yes, great-grandma is carrying a gun. If you have a family picture where great-grandma is holding a gun, you've got a party about to break out. Okay, that's all I'm gonna say. Woo! I could write a whole book just about her. But anyway, and then this is the farmhouse that they all lived in. It was actually 2-story, barely 2-story. And the girls had one room, the boys had another, and then my grandparents actually slept in the living room for many, many years until later on when most of the kids had moved out. Then they actually moved upstairs. Now, in the early morning hours of October 27th, 1959, the house caught fire. And there were 6 people in the house. My grandparents, Orville and Sarah. Sarah, of course, who the book is named after. And then their youngest son, Neil, who was 18, and just happened to be there. He'd been living in Springfield, but he came back to kind of help them with some of their chores and just kind of help them kind of look after things. Grandpa had a lot of arthritis. She was no spring chicken either, so it was getting more and more difficult for them just to do the normal things that they were going to do. Also, another son, Dewey, who had just returned from the Air Force. He had just gotten released from the Air Force and had come home for the first time with his wife, Virginia, and with their 18-month-old son, Gary. Now, by the time anybody realized the house was on fire, the first floor was pretty much engulfed. And the stairs were engulfed as well. And so there was no way that they could all get down the stairs. They were trapped on the 2nd floor. So they started jumping out of windows. On the north side of the house, you had Neil, Sarah, and Orville sleeping. Neil jumps out first, gets out, catches Sarah, and they start yelling for Orville to jump. And he waits. Orville was kind of a shy, backward man, and he was just in his underwear. What are the neighbors going to think if I'm just out in my underwear? And it's a cold night. So rather than jump, he went back into the burning room, put on his coveralls, and then finally jumped. On the other side, as all this is going on, Dewey and Virginia and little Gary are trying to get out as well. And on that side of the house, there was just this little patch of ground and then this steep drop off. And Virginia was afraid of heights, and so she doesn't want to jump. But the idea is Virginia jumps, Dewey tosses Gary down to her, then he jumps out the window and they can run around to the front of the house. She doesn't want to jump, and I don't blame her. And as she stands there while Dewey is holding little Gary, who's screaming because, you know, the whole place is going up in flames around them, she doesn't want to jump. She doesn't want to jump. She doesn't want to jump. And Dewey says, "We are burning here." And he shoves her out the window. And he shoves her too hard. She doesn't land on that little patch of grass. She goes into the tree that goes down into the gully, breaks bones. She's out. So Dewey's still in the room, holding on to Gary, gets ready to jump out the window, and the floor collapses under him. He and Gary go down into the flames. Gary is killed instantly. Dewey starts screaming, "Neil, come help me." And Neil tries to get to Dewey several different ways. So does Sarah. And then they realize there's no more screaming. Now, all of a sudden, the city of Ava has 2 deaths. 3 days later, Orville dies. Because from lingering in that room, he's ingested a lot of smoke. His lungs have pretty much turned to paper. He never really regained consciousness. 3 days later, he's gone. Now the city of Ava has a triple funeral. This is an actual photograph of the funeral. On the right, you've got Dewey and Gary in the casket on the right. Or on the left, I'm sorry. And then Orville is in the casket on the right. And the entire town of Ava is just flat. Now there were 3 survivors. Sarah, who I knew, she died in 1971, just before I turned 7. This is a family gathering. That's me right there. As a little boy, I do remember that day. And several of my cousins, of course. And I do remember that woman very, very well. She was one of the sweetest people on the entire planet. But she was in the hospital for 1.5 years, getting over her burns. Actually ended up in Colombia, where they were experimenting with new techniques for skin grafts and that type of thing. So she spent 1.5 years just getting past that before she could even put her life back together and try to move on. Virginia, of course, she loses her husband, she loses her son, and by the way, she was 3 months pregnant that night. She lost that baby as well. So she's lost everything. And all she ever wanted to be was a wife and a mother. So she's got to figure out how to keep going. And then there's Neil. I knew him very well as well. He was kind of everybody's favorite uncle. But he never got over that night. You know, whenever we go through traumatic things, the brain goes into shock normally. And what happens when you go into shock is a lot of times the tape is erased a little bit. You know, you don't remember some of the things that took place. And that's how the brain kind of preserves itself and keeps you from losing your mind, quite frankly. He never went into shock. Until the day he died, he remembered everything about that night, especially Dewey screaming, "Neil, come help me." And at one point during that night, there was a beam that came down while he was trying to get into the kitchen, got him right square in the forehead. There's a little shadow right there in that photograph. You see it on his forehead? That's the scar. He wore that mark. He looked at that mark in the mirror every day for the rest of his life. Yeah. Now, trying to research a story like that, I ran into what I call quicksand, because there are a lot of family legends about what happened that night. There was a lot of really bad information and some opinions, and quite frankly, at times, no information whatsoever. And yet I'm working forever trying to get this thing put together. If I write no other thing in for the rest of my life, I'm glad that this got written. And it took me 6 years to do it, but actually much longer than that, because I started thinking about it in college. I told my mother one day while I was in college, and we're not going to talk about how long ago that was. I told her, I said, yeah, thank you. I said, Mom, I want to talk to Uncle Neil about that night, and I want to write down what happened. And she said, don't you dare. Don't you ever talk to that man about what happened that night. So, how the hell do I research for this book? All right, so I came up with Tim's research rules to maintain your sanity, because there was an awful lot that took place during this research that I think is worth sharing. And rule number one is you can't know everything about it. Seems like a real simple statement, but you have to really think about it. There are some things that you're going to know. There are some things that you're going to be able to learn, but there are a whole lot of things, especially something that long ago, you're just not going to be able to get all the information. And let me explain to you what I mean. This is Don Souter. Don was the sheriff of Douglas County at the time of the fire. Since they were outside of the city of Ava, I thought, okay, the sheriff most likely is going to be there. Maybe he left a report behind. Maybe he wrote something down about what happened that night. So, was he there or was he not? Well, the first thing I did was go to the office of the Douglas County Sheriff. And let me tell you something, when you walk into an office like that and you say, hello, I'm a writer and I'd like to ask you about your records, you get some funny looks. So I explained to her what I was doing and what was going on and all the purpose of all of this. And she said, we didn't start keeping records until 1980. Less than nothing. But here's what I found out. Don Souter was a family friend. He wasn't Sheriff Souter, he was Don. In the logbook for my great-grandmother's funeral in 1945, he and his wife signed as guests. In the triple funeral, he and his wife signed being there. Found out he used to go hunting with my great uncle. He was there. There's no question about whether or not he was there. Then you have Clarence Clinkenbeard and his wife Inez. Clarence was the Douglas County coroner, also owned the Clinkenbeard Funeral Home and the Clinkenbeard Ambulance Service, which also doubled as a hearse. The man had the market on death cornered for Douglas County. Now, I know he was there because he was quoted in the newspaper articles, and there were numerous ones. I knew he was there. So I want to know if he kept any records since he was Douglas County coroner. So what do? I walk into the Clinkenbeard Funeral Home, and I say, hello, I'm a writer, and I'd like to ask you some questions. In a funeral home, they're looking at me like, what? Fortunately, Kirk Clinkenbeard was nice enough to hear me out, and he said, Grandpa didn't keep a lot of records, but I'll go look. And he went and looked. I mean, it sounds morbid, but I'd like to know if there's photographs that survived. He went and looked, and he came back. He said, there's nothing. He said, there's not one scrap of paper from that night. I said, okay. And just as I was getting ready to leave, his sister, who is the office manager there, she said, wait a minute. We keep every single funeral record. You know, every funeral that's ever been done here, we keep those records in our records books. Let me look. And so she did, and she found from October 31st, 1959, my uncle had ordered the funeral for all three. And it included some notes that I thought were most useful. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So there was a little something. Didn't lose everything. Granted, I didn't get what I really wanted, but I got some things that were worth having. Okay? So at least I didn't give up, but I can't know everything about it. This is the one and only photograph that was in the newspaper. I'm sorry it's not better quality than that. If I could have found an original, I would have been able to scan it. But these are the remains of the home when it was still smoldering. the next morning. And the question is, what started the fire? Now, one of my uncles is quoted in the newspaper saying, I think it was the old wood stove, which would make sense because the wood stove was hooked up to a flue that was just brick. You know, there was no liner in it. They would have flue fires on a regular basis. Dad's twin brother used to tell me, he said, sometimes we'd be sitting in the living room, and by the way, Sarah would not only wallpaper the walls, she'd wallpaper the ceiling too. And he said, we'd be sitting there and that thing would be running so hot, we would look up at the ceiling and there you would see this flame going across, burning the wallpaper as it worked its way across. This thing's got so hot inside that flue that it ignited the wallpaper. So, yeah, kind of makes sense. But I have another theory, and I found out one of my uncles shared that theory. This is the only known photograph of the kitchen. And back in those days, when you wired a place, you put one socket on the wall. Look at this far wall. You've got a refrigerator. There's a washing machine. There's an electric coffee pot. There's a mixer. You know how back in those days, they just plugged things in and plugged things in and plugged things in. And we know they were drinking coffee until late into the evening that night. I believe it was electrical. My uncle believed it was electrical, another uncle. Now, we are going to know? No. There will never be distinct knowledge of what happened that night. But here's my theory. You think about Orville being on one side of the room, lingering too long, putting his pants on, getting ready to jump. Okay? He outweighed Dewey by a whole lot, probably 100 pounds. Yet he did not fall through the floor. But at the same time, you've got Dewey over here that's trying to get Virginia out, and he's lingering and lingering and lingering. He falls through. The fire was hotter in the kitchen than it was in the living room. The wood stove was in the living room. It started in the kitchen. It didn't start in the living room. How about the ambulance? I'm asking Kirk. I said, okay, I know that there were 2 ambulances. And this, by the way, is pretty representative of what they would have had. This is a 1958 Pontiac ambulance. He said, yeah, Grandpa kept some pretty good ambulances on hand. I said, okay, let me ask you this. Number one, Sarah and Orville were pretty big people. I don't think they could have crammed them into one ambulance. He said, no, they wouldn't. But did you have any oxygen? Did you ever have any oxygen or anything like that that you could have given them? He said, no. He said, Grandpa told us throw them in there and drive like hell. Just to get them wherever they need to go, because Ava didn't have a hospital. They didn't have anybody that could take care of them. So there's no way you could have crammed all 4 people into 2 ambulances. There was one other vehicle involved, and that is in the story. So you just, you know, there are some things that you can figure out, some things you can't figure out, and some things you're just going to have to go, okay, this is my impression, I'm going with it. And that's just the way it is. Number 2, be a sponge. And my point with this is, when you're collecting information, when you're doing research, do not worry about culling that information right now. Don't worry about whether it's accurate or inaccurate. You can figure that out later. Right now, just collect it up. Soak in every single thing that you possibly can. It's just like editing. You know, you're going to write down whatever your brain says I want to write down. Later, you can edit. So later, you can go through all of those details and worry about whether it works or whether it doesn't work. But right now, you better write it down while you've got the chance. Let me explain what I mean. First, there's Aunt Lavon. Everybody's got an Aunt Lavon. She's about 3 foot nothing, -6 pounds, soaking wet. You know, when she talks to you, she says, I told you. Phone conversations with her were an hour and 10 minutes each, and after about 45 minutes, she'd finally say, so how are you? But she's the widow of Neil. And she's 81 now, I believe, 81, just turned 81. And we had a lot of conversations. And I found out later I did have to cull a lot of it, but in the beginning, she's telling me a lot of things. And one of the things she told me, she said, you know, Neil felt guilty all his life about that night because he should have woke up sooner. But the problem was he was out running around and he drank a beer that night. And Neil didn't normally drink anything. So that night he drank a beer, and so he slept a little more soundly than he normally would have. And so he felt guilty about that for the rest of his life. So I kind of tucked that back in the back of my head. Next, you have Jack Ritter, who is a cousin. He is 82 right now, I believe. I've got over 16 hours of conversation with him recorded. He may not have known he was being recorded, but I've got 16 hours of recording. But anyway, I brought up what LaVon said one time when we were talking. Brought it up to him, said, you know, this is what she said. He said, that's not true. He said, Neil didn't drink that night. I said, well, how do you know? He said, because he was with me. We were out running around Ava that night. Neil didn't drink anything. I drank several, but Neil didn't drink anything. Okay, so what do you do with that? What do you do with two completely different opinions, statements, remembrances from people who are absolutely certain that they're correct? In this particular case, I actually just left it off the page. I wasn't going to go there. That was the decision I made, culling everything else. But the main point was I've still got those two conversations in my mind and know that those existed. This guy, Tim McCormick. I worked with Tim at a chemical plant here in town. I was in the maintenance staff. He was an electrical contractor. And we've been working together for 3-4 years. And finally, one day he comes into my office and he says, what's your last name again? And I told him. And he says, so are you related to the Ritters down in Ava? And I said, yeah. He said, so you know about the family that had the twins and all that? And I said, yeah, my dad was one of the twins. So he said, you know about the fire? I said, yeah. He said, so you know about Dewey and Virginia? I said, yeah. He said, Virginia was my mother. Wow. What? We've worked together for how long and you're just now telling me this? I said, okay, let me ask you a question. And I said, I don't want to offend you, but I've got to ask you this question. My mother told me that Virginia, after she healed, pretty much lost her mind and just kind of sat around the house with pictures of Dewey and Gary all over the place and just waited for them to come home. I said, is that true? And he kind of smiled. He said, my mother was a very strong woman. I said, so it's not true? He said, no. He said, yes, she did keep pictures of Dewey and Gary her whole life. He was her first love. She was a strong woman. And I knew right then how I needed to portray her because I never met Virginia. She died just a couple of years before Tim even told me who he was. So I missed my chance. But at least I got the chance to know him. He's one of my dearest friends. Very important to me. Also, things to suck up would be articles, if you can find them. You know, there were a bunch of articles that were written about this event in Springfield and in the Douglas County Herald because of the fact that it impacted so many people, so many families. You know, there were a lot of things that were reported in those articles that ended up being a bunch of hooey. Also, I mean, you could tell they're just freewheeling. I got to write another story about this fire, so let me think. Okay, that sounds good. You know, that's some of the stuff they were doing. But one of the things that they talked about was the fact that the coroner did see Gary before he could actually get into the rubble. He did see him in the rubble, but he never saw Dewey. And the question was always on everybody's mind, what did they find? Was there anything left? What was in the casket? Was it just some ashes that were thrown in there? What was in there? And in the funeral home records, in the pages for Dewey and Gary, it said the body of the child will be buried with the body of the father. So there was something. Probably not anything very attractive, but there was something. Some sort of mass left over. So at least we knew that. This is John Paul Pitts, his wife Rachel, and their daughter Amy. And Rachel got a hold of me. She said, John Paul's parents, Paul and Modena, were there that night. They were neighbors. They were on site that night trying to give aid to the family. And John Paul doesn't remember very much of anything, but he'd like to talk to you. Let's meet at McDonald's. All right. I thought to myself, and maybe this was kind of a bad attitude that particular day, but I just thought to myself, if he doesn't remember very much, am I just going to be wasting my time? You know, is this going to be a total waste of my time? But whatever. Okay. I'll meet up with him. We'll spend some time. I'll probably be there for all of 15 minutes. That's all he's going to remember, and then I'll just go home. We sat there for an hour and a half. And the first thing out of his mouth, he said, you know, Mom and Dad, when they were getting ready to go down to where the fire was, they were grabbing blankets because this was the first cold night of the fall. He said they were grabbing blankets, and then finally they realized they're burned. We can't put blankets on them. There's no way. We cannot put blankets on them. So they tossed the blankets aside and they grabbed every sheet that they could grab. Went down to the house. And they got to the house and they saw how badly they were burned, how badly they were injured. And they said, we can't do this either. So what they did was they unrolled the sheets and stood there like this, holding the sheets around the family to protect them from the wind. First thing out of his mouth. I'm writing that down. You know, my God, if I would have been stupid enough to just not go, I would have missed that gem. So you got to be a sponge. And you got to be open to whatever anybody wants to offer up. Point number 3, dare to discover. And this is just simply an idea of taking chances. And I'm not talking about necessarily dangerous chances, but take a chance on something. Let me explain what I'm talking about. When I went to the site where this had occurred, this is essentially where Virginia fell or was pushed out the window and landed down here. And kind of the closest I could get to estimating was that. And when I took my photographs back over to see Jack and had him look at it, because he didn't go with me to the site, he said something's wrong here, because he said that was never that sloping as it appears here. It was never that smooth. It was much more abrupt like this. It was a wall. What's happened there? Well, it's very simple. We figured out that the person that bought the property afterwards, they had an earth moving company. And at some point, they bulldozed the foundation and sent it over this and then backfilled it. And as you look along that little slope, you see these stones sticking out. You remember that front porch in that old photograph? And how there were a bunch of stones like this that were piled up to make that foundation for the front porch? That's what's sticking out. And yes, I did. Take one with me. That's what's sticking out from that wall. All of that foundation is buried, or at least the top level. So we know that much. Now, I say that we didn't ever really know how much of that foundation, how much of the porch and all that stuff got scraped off. We just assumed that basically they dug up everything and sent it over the side. But just within the last couple of months, there was an exciting discovery made Where the house stood is now a corral for when they're moving cows. And there were 3 stones that were unearthed. This is just within about the last 2 or 3 months that these were discovered. And we think that maybe he just scraped it at ground level and that foundation still exists. And I'm going to try to do an archaeological dig this fall. Because here's the thing. Number one, if I can find the perimeter of that house, I'll be able to understand its true dimensions a little bit better. But even more importantly, if he just scraped the surface, that means the cellar that Dewey fell into still exists under a bunch of dirt. I want to know if it's there, and I want to dig down into it. If for no other reason than to just simply be in that space. So that's exciting. One more point. I had this picture that was up on the screen. It's my screensaver. This is the only known color photograph of that house. And halfway through writing the book is when Tim McCormick sent this to me. This is from his mother's collection. I didn't know the house was brown. I always thought it was gray. You know, black and white pictures. I always thought it was gray. And all of a sudden I find out it was brown. Brown asphalt siding that went up real quick. And incidentally, everybody in this photograph is in the book. That's Orville right there. That's Neil. And that's Dad. So dare to discover. Number 4, when in doubt, use Legos. And I'm only half kidding. My point is, don't be afraid to do something a little bit different if it helps in some way or another. I am a visual person, and I just could not get it through my head how this house was constructed. It just wasn't making sense to me. So I thought, okay, I've been a Lego guy for a long time. Thanks to my sons, I'm going to build a Lego model of this house as close to scale as I could possibly get based on the photographs I had. And on the backside, I even made it to the walls could open up so that you could see the staircase that was engulfed in flames. So the idea simply is, don't be afraid to do something different, something that might appear a little bit silly, if it helps you to figure out what's going on. Okay? Don't be afraid to do that. So in summary, the rules of research: you can't know everything about it. Be a sponge, soak up everything you possibly can, and worry about culling it later. Dare to discover and use your creativity to explore in a new way. Something different. Don't be afraid to be different. And I have a bonus rule. Because you can't do this if you don't open your mind and your heart. Because something could happen. I was on the site where the house was, and it had just been recently bought by a new family, a new couple, a deaf couple out of Nebraska. And I was there. The gate was open. The gate being open is the universal symbol for come on in, right? So I drove up to where the house used to be. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, okay, the new house is under construction up there. I'm going to drive up there and talk to whoever the contractor is, let him know who I am, see if they're okay with me just kind of milling about. I drive up to the house, nobody. There is nobody on that property. I'm trespassing now, you know. And so anyway, I thought, you know what, I'm going to wait. I'm going to see if somebody shows up. And if they do, I'm going to put on a big smile and hope I'm not on the business end of somebody's shotgun, you know? And so sure enough, here comes a truck up the driveway, and I put on a big smile, and I walk over to him, and I start introducing myself to him, and he starts doing this. He's deaf too. We can't communicate. He doesn't know who I am. So I grab my phone and furiously start typing things out and showing him and typing and showing him. And finally he figures out what's going on, and he goes, oh, sure. You know, so he's okay with it. So he goes on and does his thing. And I'm looking around. And for whatever reason, I really can't explain why I even started doing it, but there were some weeds there, and I just kind of started kicking at the weeds, maybe just to find a foundation stone or something. And I'm kicking around and kicking around and kicking around. I kick here, I go over here, I come back here, and my foot hits something. And I lean over and I pick it up, and it's a burned piece of wood. This burned piece of wood. This is a 1x4, true 1x4. They quit making these commercially in 1964. Logic tells me there is no way that a piece of wood has lasted for 60 years. But why? If I was just kicking around here, went over here, and then went back here, why did this all of a sudden show up? Why is this here? And why did my foot find it? I can't explain it. I'm not going to try to explain it. Because I've got these 6 people in here all the time. And I think this was a gift. Plain and simple. Don't care where it came from. Don't care why. It's a gift. Simply because. You know, I went on this trip to Holland a month ago and got to meet some of the actors from Band of Brothers. And the guy that played Dukeman, we went to the site where his character, Corporal Dukeman, died. And he had never been there before. And he had a very emotional reaction to standing in the spot where Dukeman died. And he told me, he said, this guy lives in me. I never met him. I don't, you know, but he lives in me. I owe him so much because he did so much for my career. And he's with me all the time. I said, I know exactly what you're talking about. So don't be afraid to let your guard down. Don't be afraid to throw logic aside. And don't be afraid to let your heart guide you in whatever it is you're going to do. So, what's your story? What's your fire? What is that piece that's been inside you for a very long time that you want to get out? If you'll do these things, then I promise you, something will happen. Can't tell you exactly what, but something will happen to your fire. As you know, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. There's my email address, my website, and I thank you. Any questions?
Can you put that previous slide up again?
Yep. Yep, absolutely. Monica.
The one color picture that you have of the house and everything, and it showed the upstairs window?
Yes.
Which window was that?
That is the window that Orville and Sarah and Neil jumped out of. Yeah, that's that side of the house. On the other side of the house, honest to God, it was only about that wide. So you get to the drop off. Yeah. So Virginia would have just kind of had to slide out the window rather than jump. Other questions? Yes.
The piece of wood that you have, Tim.
Yes.
Had you thought about taking it possibly to a lab or to a chemist to see what type of chemical properties it might possess that might answer the question, this is how it survived that long, or it can be traced, dated, carbon?
I've thought about it, but I don't want to. Because whether it is or it isn't from 1959, at this point, I don't care. Because of its significance, just the coincidence of it being there. It may have been from something else. I looked for a burn pile somewhere that it might have escaped from, you know, and there wasn't. But it might have been from something else. But I don't care because of the relative significance of a burned piece of wood where that house was. So, but good point. Yes, very true. Very true. Yes, John.
Is it a true 1x4?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you basically know it was probably part of the house.
Yeah. To me, just by the way it burned, I think it was part of the eave on the front porch.
Is it oak?
Yeah. Hard as a rock too. Hard
Is it
as.
gray?
Huh?
Is that gray?
It's weathered, very weathered. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So was it your mother or your aunt who said, don't you dare ask him?
That was my mother.
That was your mother?
Yeah.
And the conflicting stories about one beer, no beer, da.
Mhm.
So did you ever sense that she was trying to protect his story or protect him because her understanding of the story was, I had a beer.
Right. Well, Mom didn't know that part of the story. She just knew enough to be dangerous. It was Dad's side of the family, not hers. But she was basically trying to protect him. And I talked to LaVon about it, Aunt LaVon, Neil's wife, at one point while Neil was still alive, about the idea of talking to him. She said, it's going to bring an awful lot back that he's tried to forget. She said it would have to be on his time, at a time that he said was okay. And when he's done, he's done. And part of me thought I really need to do this. And part of me said, leave him alone. Because if you've read the book, you know that he spent some time in psychiatric ward, went through shock treatments, trying to rid himself of the memories. And I just felt like perhaps it would not be proper to put him through that again. He got very quiet every October. The rest of his life, very quiet every October. Yeah, so I didn't want to do that to him. Yes.
So Sarah was your grandmother?
Yes.
Did she ever talk to you about it?
No, I was 7. Well, actually, she was buried on my 7th birthday.
Okay.
So as a 6-year-old, I didn't know the questions to ask.
Right.
At 6, I knew there was a fire, and I knew there was no grandpa, because of the fire. But I didn't know the questions to ask, and so it was just Granny, can I please have another bread and butter and sugar sandwich? That was what was going through my head when Granny was around, It is interesting to know her at 58 now, as opposed to 6, and she was only 59 when it happened. So that's in my head as well, that I'm very close to the age that she was at when this happened. Yeah, but she was, oh my God, she was fantastic. What a great lady she was. Yes.
Kind of changing gears a little bit, but when you were looking at newspaper articles, did you find that you had to go there to get them, or were you successful in getting anything via internet or calling a library or newspaper office to ask for back?
Both. I went to the Douglas County Herald office and they actually pulled out their bound copies from 1959 and brought them into the room to flip through. That was on visit number 1. Visit number 2 to their office, they had been sold. They were no longer a little mom and pop newspaper, and they said, go to newspapers.com. Okay. And then fortunately, there were Jack, the cousin, he had copies of the Springfield newspaper articles. And so I was able to get those from him. But I have found a ton of things on newspapers.com that don't just pertain to that event. I found the address for the house that Granny lived in when she got out of the hospital, the kind of, intermediary house. I found that address, and that house still does stand on North Grant. So anyway, there was a lot of information that I was able to get.
Were the pictures that you saw on newspaper.com, were they clear enough to be usable in your book? Did you try to use any of those?
Not really. I mean, there were so few that were ever in the paper, just basically that one that I showed you. That was it. There was really nothing else, but you know how things are printed in the newspaper and all they're doing is scanning those in, you know, and making them a searchable document. So that's pretty much what you get.
Okay.
You know, the quality that's in the newspaper is the quality that you're going to get.
So if you find a picture, then you need to go trace down an original as close as possible.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else over here? Yes.
You know, the Virginia second president,
Yes.
the big guy?
Yeah.
In the book?
Yeah.
Was the electrician his son?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There are two children, actually. Tim has a sister, Joy. She was the first child. Yes, and they are McCormick's children. And that brings up another issue. I talked to Tim. I said, okay, you've told me what kind of person your father was. I'm going to tell that story. I'm going to put it in there if you're okay with it. He said, fine with me. I only met the man once. You know, he never sent any child support. I met him the day he died. You know, he said, he wasn't my dad. Her third husband really was the nice one that Tim and Joy really consider to be, you know, their dad, and they saw what a good man he was to their
Yeah, the
mother.
reason I asked that is because I wondered who was telling you the information about him. That you know, you knew the sheriff, that Rustin went to his house.
Yeah, it was Tim and Joy
Okay.
that told me about that. We had a dinner one night over at Tim's place, and he not only brought in his sister, you know, and all that, but he brought in some of Joy's siblings. Some of Virginia's siblings that still live. You know, her brother Donald even told me, he said, I loved Dewey so much. He was the reason why I went into the Air Force, because he would sit and talk to me about what he learned in the Air Force. So he said, I knew I had to go in. You know, he said, I just loved it. And they would all get all choked up, you know, as they talked about Dewey and Virginia for that matter. Yeah, yes.
I'm sorry, audiobook? Are you doing an audio?
Oh, yeah, it exists. It exists.
Ready?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, is it
Yeah, you
on
can access it on Amazon.
Amazon?
Yeah, or ACX. The January presenter that we had, Tiffany Renee Samples, she was my narrator. I knew I did not want a male to tell that story because I didn't like how a male puts on a female voice. And with Sarah being the main character, I knew that I had to have a female on there. And the last time I talked to her, she said that she very much looks forward to her next audiobook adventure where she doesn't have to cry and scream so much. Sorry, I was so tough on you. Yes.
I think one of the very important things that you brought out here, it came to my mind, and that is the witnesses to those experiences. As a retired law enforcement officer, when you go into a tragic situation, people will tell you, when the memories are fresh right there, what happened. As time goes by, that changes.
Yes, sir.
I had a very dear friend of mine who was a lieutenant. He told me he was an Air Force Ranger. And he said his experience, World War II vets that he knew growing up and what have you, that fought in the real battles, did not want to talk about it. They would not talk about it. But the people that weren't in the real battles, that were in the military, talk about it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't see the forward.
Right.
The same thing applies to my career with law enforcement officers. You grow into a place where you isolate yourself just among your own group.
Yeah.
Because you can talk freely with family about things. Because they understand.
Mm-hmm. They were there.
They were there, maybe not at that situation, but similar situations.
Mm-hmm.
And not too many years ago, about 3 years ago, I guess it was, I reunited with an old friend of mine. We went through the academy together in 1966. And we got reunited. He left after about 12 years. We had a lot of experiences together. And one of those out of Mayor Brady said with me, it was called Drinking Coffee at Night, about some of the things, sharing some success stories and what have you. He said, John, do you sleep good at night? And I said, oh, pretty well, for the most part. He said, I don't. He said, how do you get all that out of your mind? And I said, what are you talking about? You've got no guilt on your shoulders, boy. And we just did it back and forth. He said, no, seriously, how do you get that out? The things we saw. He told me a reminder one month, so I was never going to go that time to have by train. So I was. Up there, had still alive, and looked at me, and I'll never get that out of my head.
Yeah.
And he told me of another one. See, I was there on that. He said, how do you get that out? I said, George, I got a special place I follow that stuff, and I don't bring it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just don't
Exactly
bring it
right.
back. I guess the something like that was a good self-care I learned from him.
Yeah.
Just follow it away.
Yeah.
And something will trigger it to bring it back.
Yeah.
Since I retired in 2001, there have been 6 retired police officers who committed suicide. George committed suicide within 3 months of that conversation.
See, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't talk to Neil.
Wait for law enforcement for 25 years.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the things that spooked me about talking to Neil.
So you're not going to get that. You talk to the people, like you said, that they have talked to or
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
When you talk to them, they're going to insulate themselves.
Oh, yeah. And I don't blame them a bit. You know, everybody, if we all in this room went outside and watched a car accident, we would all come away with it with very different impressions. I mean, that's just human nature. It's just the way it is. So I understand the different ideas and different views of what happened that night. I also figured out eventually that LaVon had an axe to grind. If everything she told me is true, I've got a half brother out there somewhere. Questions, yes.
When you were doing your research, did you have trouble with finding yourself with multiple rabbit holes you could follow that would lead you to just such a, I mean, you get to a place where you couldn't go any farther, but you wanted to find more, and it would actually discourage you from wanting to go elsewhere?
Not really. Chapter 2 was my biggest problem because I wanted to give background information. I knew you weren't going to want to read the book if you didn't fall in love with the people. And so I had to give enough background information for you to fall in love with them. And the first version that I did was much larger than what wound up in the book. And maybe that's where my occurrence of that was, because I had a hard time figuring out what to include and what to leave out, because I wanted you to know everything. And one of my dearest friends from high school, who's an avid reader, she was a test reader for me. And she said, you have got to thin out chapter 2. She said, there's way too many names and dates to keep track of. I can't do it. I just can't do it. So that led me to crop a lot, several pages, probably 6 pages at least out of chapter 2. And it still was long. It's the longest chapter in the whole book, you know, but otherwise, I kind of stayed on point because there was a direct line on each of them. I kind of plotted it out before I started writing. It's like, okay, Sarah went this direction. She had this, and this. You know, Neil had these items. Virginia had these items. So all I have to do is work on getting the dates right and the timeline right, and then just start mixing them in the way that I did. Because I didn't want you to get bogged down by one of them one at a time. I wanted you to watch all 3 of them as they progressed in their various ways, or perhaps regressed in some cases. Anybody else?
So is there gonna be a movie?
You know, I am toying with the idea of a screenplay. And I already know I want Kathy Bates to play Sarah. It would be cool if there was. And actually, it's kind of funny because the 3 actors that I met from Band of Brothers, they each have a copy now of the book. So it would be nice if, you know, But yeah, that would really be cool. But honestly, I would not want it to be done just halfway. It'd have to be something done extremely well. And I've already got the soundtrack in my head too for it. Seriously, there was a bunch of songs that I found by this band that most of you would probably hate. And because it's noisy. But I found several songs that they did across 4 albums that for whatever reason put me there, you know, and I just put it on a random loop and just wrote. And some of the music sounds terrifying. Some of it sounds hopeful. And a lot of times, just as I'm writing something about Sarah, where she's trying to be hopeful about the future, that hopeful song just happens to come on. Drives me there. I know the opening song for the movie, and I know the song that's going to play when Sarah is making her way in the final scene to the headstone.
So what band?
They're called Russian Circles. Yeah, very noisy. But I had to put myself in the final scene, but it's because of the fact I really was there as a 2-year-old. My siblings, my dad, my mom. That's us in that final scene. And in that photograph that's in there of Sarah standing at the headstone for the first time, that's me in Dad's arms and my sister standing there. And my sister told me, she said, I remember that day. I remember, I had my little white purse and I was so excited about being there with Granny, and I didn't understand why everybody was so sad. It really messed me up because I didn't understand what was going on. So anyway. Anybody else? Yes, Art.
If you're doing research on a topic that has already, like, with my case, then ministry of title set. Numerous books have been written. How do you find the difference? How do you find your voice amidst a huge assembly of all these others that are in there?
That's the $1 million question. Honestly, the way I kind of did it, based on what all I was listening to, because I heard all those voices, and every time I wrote dialogue for my aunts and uncles, I heard them speaking because I knew these people. You know, I could hear Granny laughing in my head, even though I haven't heard it since I was 6. I could hear her. What I did, I'd read this stuff and then play it back in my head in my own voice. Follow me? You gain the knowledge from what you read, but then you play it back in your own voice. And that's how, at least I was able to get my voice, to tell it. All right, I'll be certainly open to other questions afterwards if you like, but just in the effort to keep things rolling forward, we'll go ahead and shut this down. But I thank you for the comments, the questions, and I appreciate everybody joining in on